We're all good. Wonderful. I've done Grace out of a job this morning, and I've bought my own water up. So, but she's not here this morning anyway, is she? I can't see her. So that was a good job. But yes, I've done her out of a job this morning. It's great to be with you guys this morning, to be able to share with you this morning. And I'm going to start the message in probably a little bit of a strange way, and with how I'm starting it, you're probably going to think, oh dear, he's obviously had a bad week. But last night I was sat with some friends and we were talking about whiskey, and obviously straight away you're thinking, wow, the pastor's been in the job 2 weeks and already he's gone to the bottle. Considering I'm teetotal and I don't drink, that could be a really bad way to start a message. But we were talking about whiskey and about the process of how it's distilled and the time that it takes and the value that's added to matured whiskey. The longer it's matured, the more valuable it is and the more desired it is. And we were talking about some of the ridiculous prices that whiskey goes for, and it got me really intrigued. And so I started looking up last night, and there's some that have gone for $2.6 million was the most expensive bottle that I could find. But you can go out and buy a bottle of whiskey for £30,000. That's just on the shelf. You can go out and buy one of those. But it made me realise that the value comes from the maturity that it develops over time, that it's in a distillery, it's put into a cask, and then it's matured in that cask over a period of time. And I remember one of the questions when we were in Bible college that was asked is a guy called Peter in the Bible, if you've not heard of him. He's the first person who kind of delivered a sermon after the Holy Spirit had come down to earth, and it was on the day of Pentecost, and he stumbled out of the room and they all looked drunk. All the disciples looked drunk, and everyone around was saying, these guys are all just idiots, they're all drunk, it's 10 o'clock in the morning and they're all absolutely plastered, a bit like it sounds like I was, but I wasn't, I can promise you that. But Peter stumbles out and starts to deliver this message, and the question that was asked in Bible college was, how long did Peter have to prepare for this message? And quite a few people said, well, he came up with it on the spot. It was an instant message. He didn't have time to prepare. He didn't know that he was going to share it. He just walked out of the upper room, saw the people, and God put it on his heart to start sharing, and he did. One of the other answers that came out was, well, Peter had 3 years to prepare for this. And one of the other answers was, well, actually, Peter had an entire lifetime to prepare for this. You see, the life that Peter led and the time that he spent with Jesus was the preparation. It was like being sat distilling in that cask, maturing, allowing things to develop inside of him, so that at the point where the message came forth, that was when it was matured and at the right place. But it wasn't that moment that it was delivered. It was the process that it went on to create that message at that point. And all of us go through a process. All of us have come from somewhere and are going to somewhere and are currently in our position, and that all creates a process, a bit like that distillery. We're all sat in our cask, processing and developing and maturing to the point where we can then be used to deliver the message that we need to deliver at the moment that we need to deliver it, or to say the right thing to someone at the moment that we need to say it, or to do the right thing at the moment that we need to do it. And so I wanted to start my message by sharing a little story of a process that I began probably 15, 16 years ago now, or thereabouts. It was probably a little bit less, 14 years I think. But the title of my message this morning is Don't Look Back. And this was a lesson that I started to learn, as I say, about 14 years ago. And the reason I learned this lesson about 14 years ago was I used to cycle to school. I used to go about 2 miles from Heath Hayes to Norton Keynes was where I used to go to school. And so every morning I would cycle. And I used to cycle with a friend of mine who lived just around the corner. And my friend was a really good friend, and I liked my friend a lot. But he wasn't a Christian guy, and he wasn't the best influence on me. And my mum said, I don't want you to cycle with him to school in the morning, because we would end up just sort of hanging about and getting there late, or we would take forever getting home and things like that. So she said, I want you just to go straight to school on your own and cycle by yourself. And so this morning I set off to cycle to school, and I'd not told my friend that I wasn't going to be cycling with him. And so I was going down the Norton Keynes main road, and all of a sudden I heard my name shouted behind me, and I thought, I'm sure that can't be my name. And so I carried on cycling a little bit, and I heard it again. And so as I heard it for the second time, I decided to try and turn around to see what was going on behind me. The thing that happens when you turn your head on a bicycle is your hands tend to go with it. And so what happened is I turned my hand as I looked behind me, just as I was going past a lamppost, and managed to drive straight into... Thank you, Lizzie, that was very kind of you. Most people would go, oh, that's terrible, were you okay? Lizzie just burst out laughing. But as I turned my head to look behind me, I hit this lamppost full on the side of my head and skidded straight into the middle of the road, which was a main road in Norton Keynes. Fortunately, there were no cars coming. And so I quickly got myself back up, checked that I was still in one piece. The worst thing that happened was I lost a zipper off my coat. I'd managed to slide across the road and skid the zipper straight off. But I got to school and then realised at the time I wore glasses. And where I'd hit the lamppost, my glasses had bent in that shape into the side of my head. And so I was driving along thinking, wow, my head really, really hurts as I was going to school. And as I got there, my glasses were in like a V shape into the side of my head. But I realised the mistake I made was looking back whilst I was trying to move forward and constantly looking back. And I can promise you at that point after that, I didn't look back while I was riding my bicycle again. I had learned that lesson at that point. But there's times where we have to keep remembering to learn this lesson as we go forward in life. And as I say, we've looked a little bit at the Apostle Peter. And we're going to take a little bit of his story. So if you've got your Bibles, turn to John chapter 21. And we're going to learn a little bit from the Apostle Peter this morning. But as I say, the message is entitled, Don't Look Back. And it's a lesson that started years and years ago. And for all of us, it's a lesson that we start learning as soon as we begin life. Yeah. But we carry on learning it every single day through the things that we go through. And we're going to look at John chapter 21. And to give you a little bit of context, Jesus has been on the earth, spent 3 years with the disciples, has been crucified, has been raised back from the dead. And now this is kind of where we pick up the story. In John chapter 21 and from verse 1 it says, After these things Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself. So this is how Jesus showed himself to the disciples. It says, Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we are going with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, Children, have you any food? And they answered him, No. And he said to them, Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to the land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish which you have just caught. And Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. I'm going to pause there for just a moment. Here we've got a story of Peter encountering Jesus again. But the fascinating thing that I find is that Peter has spent 3 years with Jesus, learning from Jesus, and encountering all the things that Jesus has done, all the wonderful, amazing things that he's done. But after Jesus has died, they're left a little bit unsure as to what they were supposed to do. They were called to go and make fishers of men. They were called to go into all the world and make disciples of men. But they weren't sure quite how they were supposed to do that. And then Jesus turns back up to the disciples. And the fascinating thing that I find is this isn't the first time that the disciples encountered Jesus after he'd died. This is the 3rd time that Jesus had showed himself back up. We can see in chapter 20 that there's 2 other times where Jesus appears to the disciples, and it took the 3rd time for them to actually find out what Jesus wanted them to do, for them to actually get the idea that no, we're not supposed to just go back to fishing. We're actually called to do something more, because that's exactly what Peter had decided. He said, well, you know what? I'm going to go back to what I know. I'm going to go back to doing the things that I used to do before Jesus turned up. He was a fisherman before Jesus found him, and so he decided, you know what, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I'm just going to go back to what I know, the things that I know, the things that I'm good at. So he decided, right, and to be honest, he probably wasn't very good at fishing, because there's a couple of instances in the Bible where we see that he went out all night and couldn't catch anything. So I say he went back to what he was good at. He went back to what he knows. I don't know whether he was any good at it. The Bible doesn't say, but we can certainly extrapolate from the data that he might not have been the best fisherman out there. But he decides to go back and do the fishing because that's what he knows. Those are the things that he's grown up doing and knew to do. And it's in this moment that he encounters Jesus, and he encounters him in the very similar way to how he first encountered Jesus. And I'm going to read a little bit of that from Luke chapter 5. This is the first time they encounter Jesus. And in verse 4 it says, "When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, 'Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch.' But Simon answered and said to him, 'Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net.' And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to the partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down on Jesus' knees, saying, 'Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord.' For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, 'Do not be afraid, for now you will catch men.'" Another translation says, "For now I will make you fishers of men." This is the moment where Jesus says that you're going to do something different to what you grew up doing. This is the moment where you're going to change the whole purpose of your life. And then Peter spends 3 years with Jesus learning how to do that, learning how to become a fisher of men. But as soon as Jesus departs from them, as soon as it's Peter's turn to take over the reins and start running his life in the course that God's called him to, he decides to go back to the way that he was always doing things. He decides to fall back on the things that he knows and lean back onto those. He decided to look back. As I said, the message this morning is called "Don't Look Back," because what happens is at that moment, Jesus turns up to him and says, "Look, you've done it again. You've gone out all night. You've caught absolutely nothing. Go back out and fish again." And when he went back out, they pulled in a multitude of fish, so much that it filled the boat. And in fact, they actually counted the number of fish that they brought in. It was 196, I think it said in John chapter 21 there. But what happened was, as Peter had gone back to the things that he knew, the things that he thought he was good at doing, and the things that he thought, well, if there's nothing else, I will just go back and do this. Jesus turned up and said, "This isn't what I've called you to. I haven't called you to the things that you used to do. I haven't called you to the things that you used to know, but I've called you for something greater than that. Amen. I've called you to go into all the earth and make disciples of every nation, to teach them the ways." And Jesus said to them that I will be with you no matter what. In every situation, I'll be walking with you. But Peter says, I'm going to go back to the things that I knew. One of the fascinating things that I love about these two passages of Scripture from Luke chapter 5 and then from John 21 is in Luke chapter 5 we see that they went out, they threw down the nets on the other side of the boat, and they had this multitude of fish that they caught, so much so that the nets began to break and that they had to bring in another boat to help with the provision to bring it in. But what we then see in John chapter 21 is the same thing happens. They go out and they catch a multitude of fish, more than they should ever be able to catch. But there's an interesting phrase in John chapter 21, and at the end of, in fact, we'll turn back to there just so I get it right, because I would hate to muck it up. At the end of John chapter 21, and it says this, it says, in verse 11, it says, "Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not broken." As I say, like whiskey, it takes a maturing process and a period of time to develop to the place where we're supposed to be. When Jesus first encountered Peter and called him to be a fisher of men, he didn't have the equipment required to fulfill the catch that was out there. The net was at the point of breaking. It began to break, and they needed other people to come around and draw in and help them. But then Peter spent 3 years learning from Jesus, being equipped by Jesus. And then we read in John chapter 21 that the same thing happens, that there's a multitude of fish that they catch, but the nets are at the point of breaking, but don't break. As we go through a maturing process, if we're willing to walk in the path that God's called us to, when we first start out, we won't have everything that we need to be able to do the things that God's called us to. And if he showed us the end at the very start, we'd probably turn around and say, we'd never be able to do that. It was very similar when we converted the hub a couple of years ago. When we first started, if you'd have told us that this was what we were going to have, we never would have got there, because it seemed a mammoth task. We decided that we were just going to paint the walls. That was all we'd ever intended to do. As you can see now, we've done a little bit more than paint the walls. If you haven't seen, go through and have a look. We did more than paint the walls. We moved walls. We did all sorts of things. But if we'd have seen the end from the beginning, we'd have said, that's too much. We can't afford to do that. That's too much. There's too much work required to go into it. Peter had exactly the same thing, that if he was shown the end from the beginning, that he wouldn't have been equipped to do that. But what happens is the maturing process that he spent with Jesus, the time that he spent with Jesus, gave him the equipment required, gave him the skills and the abilities required to then fulfill the call that he was going out to. And it's exactly the same with each and every one of us, that there's a moment where we encounter Jesus. There's a moment where if you've been born again, you said, God, I need you in my life because I know that I can't do this without you. And God comes in, Jesus comes and dwells on the inside of us, the Holy Spirit dwells on the inside of us. But at that moment, we still need people around us to help us and develop us. Peter needed the other boats to come along and grab the load and help him with that. And even with the two boats, there was so much that it began to sink, but they managed. And sometimes our walk can be exactly the same, that at the point where we begin, we're not equipped to deal with all the situations, and we need people around us to do that. And that was why the church started, was to be the people around us that can help us through those situations, to be the person next to you who can help that person through their situation that they're going through, to help take the load. But what happens is, as we go through life, as we begin to learn from God, we develop to the point where we can begin to handle our own problems. We can begin to handle the own pressures that come upon us and the weight of our own responsibility, that we begin to be equipped to deal with that ourselves. And then we start to equip others to deal with their own issues, to deal with their own problems, or to deal with the situations that they face. But that's what we're called to be as a church, that we're called to have that purpose, not to look back and constantly think, I'm not capable of doing this, I'm just going to go back to what I know. As I said last week, I'm sure at some point all of us will face a moment in our walk with God where we say, I don't know if I can do this anymore. To be honest, there's many times where I've had that, where I've just stood there and think, I don't think I can do this anymore. Those are the moments where most people might turn to the whiskey or to the gin or something like that. It looked almost like I had this morning. I noticed that Joy saw that as I took a sip of water from my glass. I can promise you it's water, but I took a sip and then stumbled sideways quite quickly. It is water and not gin, I promise you. But at those moments, we could decide that we can't cope, we can't go beyond where we're at. But if Peter had made that same decision to say, you know what, I'm just going to stick with the fishing because that's all I know how to do. I'm not equipped to deal with the things that God's called me to. Where would we be? Where would the church be? That message on Pentecost wouldn't have existed because Peter would have just gone back to fishing. But one of the wonderful things that I find in John chapter 21 as well is not only did Jesus say, cast your net out and you'll pull in a multitude of fish again, but what happened is as they went back to the shore, they found that God's provision was already there. There was already a coal fire going with fish and bread there. And what Jesus said to Peter was, bring some of the fish that you've caught and add it to the food that I've already got. What we find is as we go through life, we struggle sometimes, but God's provision never leaves us. God's provision is always there. And when we turn to him, we find the provision. And Jesus says, bring the little that you've got and add it to the much that I have. On our own, we'll never feel equipped to deal with the circumstances that face us. But if we turn to the people around us, if we turn to God, we'll realise that the provision is already there. But we're still called to play our part. We're still called to do our bit. But the interesting thing about doing our bit, about being a disciple and a follower of Christ, is it calls us to do some crazy things sometimes. It calls us to step out of the boat and be a little bit of an idiot. And the reason I say that is because I look at Peter and what happened in this passage. And it says, from verse 6, it says, and he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. And therefore that disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, about 200 cubits, which is about 100 yards. When Peter heard that it was Jesus on the land, he did two things that I find very strange. The first thing that he did was he put on his clothes and then he went swimming. I don't know about you, but if I'm going swimming, I'm taking off my clothes. I have never thought, this is the perfect opportunity for a swim, let me grab my coat. I've never done that. I don't know if I'm just the only one, but Peter had this moment where he said, God's on the shore, let me grab my coat, I'm jumping in. The other strange thing that he did was he swam rather than getting in the boat. The other disciples were sensible. They said, you know what, we're 100 yards from the shore. We can row 100 yards. Peter thought, forget this. I am going full force straight over the side of the boat and I'm going to swim to shore because I am getting there as quick as I possibly can, fully clothed and everything. being a disciple for Christ quite often calls us to do things that seem strange to the people around us. It requires us to live fully devoted to the cause. It requires us to say, if Jesus is over there, then I'm going to do everything I need to get over there. I'm not going to hang about for the boat to be launched. I'm not going to hang about for other people to catch up with me. But I'm going to turn around and say, if Jesus is on the shore, I'm jumping overboard and swimming to the shore. If Jesus is over there, I'm going over there. If Jesus is that way, I'm going that way. That's what it means to be a follower of Christ. When Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11, imitate me as I follow Christ, what he's saying is, if I jump overboard, you jump overboard. If I swim, you swim. If I put on my coat, you put on your coat, and we're going to get wet together. Because what he's saying is the church is required to follow Christ with whatever it takes, in whatever situation it takes, and with everything that we've got, regardless of what we face.
Good teaching. Amen.
The vision of our church is to reach, to teach, and to mobilize. And if we're going to reach people, we have to decide that we're going to be a little bit stupid sometimes. Some of us might find that easier than others. Some of us might find it really easy to jump out of the boat. There's other people sat here who might think, I can't jump out of the boat. That's not what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to get in the little boat and row along. There's people along the way that we need to row the boat as well. I'm sure Peter probably had another change of clothes or something in the boat. And so when the other disciples turned up on the shore a couple of minutes later, they went, Peter, here's your other coat. I'm guessing, but that might not have happened. But you know what? We need other people around us to row the little boat. But there needs to be people who are willing to say, you know what? Forget the boat. I'm jumping in. I'm swimming full force. And I'm going for what Jesus is calling me to. I'm going wherever Jesus is. And I know that the provision will be there when I get there. I know that I will be equipped to do the things that I need to do when Jesus calls me to do it. As I say, we're called to reach, to teach, and to mobilize. And over the next 12 months, what you're going to hear is 6 ways in which we're going to reach the community around us, because the church isn't about us. And that might seem strange. You might sit there and think, well, I thought the church was us. The church is us, but it's not about us. Amen. The church is about reaching out into the community, reaching the lost, and seeing the people with the need. The church isn't about being a place where all the needs are met. The church is about saying, come here so that we can help you meet your needs. The church isn't about people who are found. The church is about being a place where the lost can be found.
Amen.
In Matthew 25, Jesus laid out 6 areas of need when he says, I was in prison and you came to me. And the 6 areas that he talks about is food and water and clothing and shelter and health and freedom. So over the next 12 months, you will find out how the church, this church, will help to meet the community in each of those 6 areas. You will hear times where we're putting on events to reach those things. You will hear times where we are going to do things that will reach out into the community to meet those needs. Because if we can't reach, how can we teach? How can we mobilize? Because the first step that we have to make is to reach into the community. The church is not about us. The church is about the people around us, and we are the church called to meet the people around us. If we're not reaching out into the community, we are not being church. Church is not about sitting in here on a Sunday, listening to someone talk about drinking whiskey and then go out afterwards. Church isn't about sitting here and hearing a nice message that tells us to jump overboard and then leaving. Church is about getting together, saying, how can we make a difference in the community around us?
Wonderful.
I love the way that the church was founded, because it started on that day of Pentecost with a group of 120 people stumbling out the door looking absolutely plastered and then delivering the best sermon that Peter had ever delivered.
Yes, absolutely.
The church is called to look exactly the same way, to walk out of those doors and look crazy, to walk out of those doors and say we might look stupid, but it's because we know the Jesus that's calling us and we know what he's calling us to.
Amen.
If we can't reach the community, we're lost.
Yeah.
The church should be a place where the lost can be found, not where lost people sit together in a huddle.
Very good.
So if you're sat on your chair this morning feeling a little bit uncomfortable, get used to it. If you're sat on your chair this morning thinking this doesn't sound like the church that I'm used to, decide whether you can get used to it. Because if you can't, I will send you on with all the blessings in the world and find a church that will help you meet those needs of sitting there comfortable. But if you're willing to jump overboard, if you're willing to put on your coat and jump in and get wet,
Brother, amen.
then this is the church for you.
Hallelujah.
If you're willing to stand there and say, I want to reach my community, not the person sat next to me, I want to work with the person sat next to me to reach my community, then this is the church for you. But this is the last time you'll sit on a chair comfortably, because it requires action, it requires moving, it requires doing something. And so, as I say, over the next 12 months you will hear how we will be doing things in our community, but it requires action from all of you. If the focus is on ourselves, we will spend more time bickering with one another, we will spend more time hurting one another unintentionally or intentionally, and we will spend more time sat on our backsides than we will in the community. But if we change the focus from ourselves to the people around us, we will move out from here and we'll say, you know what, this isn't the place that matters, that's the place that matters, and this is a place that can help the place out there. We will go out into our community and make a difference.
Praise God.
One of the
Hallelujah.
One of the things that I was reading about this week was an organisation called TLG. They help with children. And one of the quotes that was put on there from a church that was using the TLG material, the pastor of the church said, we want to be a church where the community feels a loss if we're no longer part of it. My question is, would the community feel a loss if this church was no longer a part of it? If those doors shut today and never opened again, would the community feel a loss? The telling sign is that quite often people say, we don't even know where your church is. We've never heard of your church. That has to change. We cannot make a difference in the community if people don't even know where we are. We cannot make a difference in the community if people don't know who we are. And so, as I say, we will walk into our community. We will do things that reach out to the community and bring the community into here, but it's not so that we can have more bums on the seats. It's not so that we can have a really full worship session that looks great and sounds wonderful because there's 150 or 200 people crammed into this room. But we will reach out to the community because that's what we're called to do.
Amen.
Because our vision is to go and make disciples of every nation. That is the calling that was placed on our life. But if we choose to look back, if we choose to say, hang on a minute, what I was doing before was much easier. What I was doing before was much more comfortable. The things I was doing in the past didn't require so much sacrifice or so much effort. We'll never get beyond where we are now. In fact, what happens is we go along, we look back, and just like I did, you hit the lamppost and skid off sideways. The interesting thing I find about lampposts is they're there to guide the way. They're there to light the path that you're supposed to be going along. If we choose to look back, the vision will hit us in the face and knock us sideways. If we choose to look back and say, I don't know if I can do it, all of a sudden we will come along and hit full force with what God is calling us to do. Encounter God and skid sideways, but it's whether we get back up at that moment. We can use the lamppost for what it's designed for, to light the path that God's calling us to, or we can choose to look back. We will still find the lamppost. We just find it with a different part of our body. I encourage you this morning, don't find the lamppost with your head, because it hurts. It really hurts. It knocks you sideways, and it takes a lot to get back up. It knocks you into danger. But if you're willing then to stand up and say, you know what, I need to look where I'm going. I need to look forward and not what's calling from behind. I don't need to focus on the past things that have happened, but I need to focus on the things that are calling me forward. I need to focus on the direction that I'm heading. Don't look back.
Amen.
Let the lamppost guide you and not knock you sideways. Let the lamppost enlighten the path that we're called to. To me, the lamppost is the word of God. It says in Psalm 119 that your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. The word of God should be the very first thing that directs us in the call that we have. The thing that Jesus said to Peter was, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Jesus' words were the first part of the call that he was placed on. And we should be the same, that Jesus' word should be the very first thing that calls us. And then we find out how his word can affect our lives, how his word can speak to us and cause us to walk the way that we're called to be. Next week you'll hear about the teams in the church and the way that the church is structured. And as I said, this is the last week where you will be able to come in and sit comfortably on a chair. Because next week you will see gaps in the church that need filling. Next week you will see spaces in teams that need help, because without those spaces being filled, we won't be able to effectively minister to the church and the community around us. But if you're willing to get up and say, I can fill that space, if you're willing to get up and say, I can work with that team to develop my community around me, then I encourage you to come back next Sunday. So my question is this: how long have you been maturing? And are you willing to look back? Have you looked back? Because you don't want to. And that might sound really daft to say you don't want to look back, but trust me, you don't. Because somewhere along the way, God's vision hits us and knocks us into the right direction. But we can either use it as a stepping stone and a guidance into where we're going, or we can be knocked silly and then get back up and start doing what we're supposed to be doing. And then my challenge to you guys is take a look at yourself. Take a look at what you can do and what God's called you to. Take a look at the first thing that you felt from God when you first became a Christian and you thought, this is my heart for helping the body of Christ grow. Take a look at that and then say, where can that fit in the church? When you see next week the gaps that are needed to be filled, turn around and say, I can fill that gap. Turn around and say, I'm willing to jump overboard, coat and all, get wet and swim wherever Jesus is. If Jesus is over there, I'm going over there. Because that's what it means to be a disciple and a follower of Christ, is to say, I'm going to get wet, I'm going to get heavy. Sometimes it might be hard work, but I'm going to swim regardless to find Jesus and the path that he's calling me on. Don't look back. Thank you.
Amen.